For more than 20 years, Americans have been told the story of 9/11 and saying, you know what, it's settled, case closed, don't ask questions, don't look too closely. And if you do, well, you're accused of being disrespectful, unpatriotic, or crazy. But one man, thousands of miles away, is forcing uncomfortable questions back into the open. Matt Campbell is a British citizen. His brother, Jeff Campbell, was killed in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And unlike most families, Matt didn't accept a death certificate and move on because the explanations he was given didn't make any sense. In the United Kingdom, deaths can be re-examined through a coroner's inquest, and Matt Campbell has spent years fighting to reopen his brother's case using new evidence about how the towers were destroyed, evidence that was never tested in a courtroom, evidence that was never subjected to cross-examination, evidence that governments insist you don't need to see. And what's happened since is telling. Roadblock after roadblock, bureaucratic resistance, reluctance from the Attorney General, even the UK Supreme Court stepping in, not to examine the evidence, but to prevent it from being heard. So ask yourself, if the official 9/11 narrative is rock solid, why is there such fear of a courtroom? Matt Campbell joins us now to explain his fight, what new evidence he has, why governments are so desperate to shut it down, and why, more than 20 years later, the truth about 9/11 is still being treated as dangerous. Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for having me on.
First of all, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know it's been a while, but I'm sure the pain is still there. Tell us about your brother and what he was doing on 9/11. Where was he?
Yeah, I mean, my brother, was an intelligent, funny guy. He loved New York. He'd moved out there in '99. He was attending a conference on the 106th floor of the North Tower. Wasn't his usual place of work. It was just, one of those things. It was something that he was attending. I thought, by the way, you've just summarized my fight brilliantly. That was absolutely spot on, because that's how it's been, those roadblocks. And, that resistance in the background, not to let either questions or new evidence come to light.
So did he work in the towers? Did he work nearby, or was he just visiting from the UK?
No, he was living in New York. He worked for Reuters, so his offices were up in Midtown. He was just there for the conference. He sent an email a few minutes past 8 o'clock in the morning, local time in New York, saying that he was running late for the conference. We think he perhaps got there 10 minutes before. If he'd been a little bit later, got up a bit later, he wouldn't have made it, I'm sure.
Okay. So obviously we've all been fed the official story. Al-Qaeda flew planes into the towers. That's it. When did you become suspicious of that narrative? Was it right away or was it later?
It actually started probably end of October 2001. There was an article that I read by the late John Pilger, a journalist in the UK. I think that the article was titled "This War is a Farce," and it was basically talking about what was going on in Afghanistan. I think the bombing had started for a couple of weeks, and it just talked about things like, most of the hijackers were Saudi, most of them had done their training in the US and Germany, and it was like, what are we doing in Afghanistan? And that was really the start of the process for me. Very much interested in the paper trail initially. And I think a lot of sort of mainstream journalists, as well as alternative ones, were, coming out with books over the first few years, exposing a lot of the intelligence failures. I mean, some of that was touched upon itself during, with the 9/11 Commission report, but it just built basically over the years. I never really considered the way that the towers came down until probably sort of 2007, 2009, something like that. I was always more focused on, the failures, I guess, of what happened that day.
I think that's how most of us were. I mean, when an event like that happens, it's so shocking that I think most of us kind of went into the how did this happen mode, not how did it happen, like who actually did it and the details of that, but more of a how did they let this happen? This was a giant failure. How did they not know that this was coming? I think that's what most people focused on. But then after time went on, there were a lot of suspicious, then there's people asking questions, but what about this or what about that? Or, and why is it that we're invading Iraq when it was a bunch of Saudi nationals that were trained in the United States and in Germany, like you mentioned? Like, what's the connection there? And then things start to, and of course now, hindsight, I think many of us ask a lot of questions. I think a lot of people that weren't asking questions at all at that time are now asking questions. And I don't think we're called conspiracy theorists as much these days. What was your experience when you first? I mean, there you are. You had a brother. Your brother, I believe, he was just 1 year younger than you. You lose him in 9/11. You're questioning things. How were you treated when you were questioning things?
I mean, it was mainly with just family and friends, I guess, in the early years. I didn't really go public until, well, shortly after his inquest that was actually held initially in 2013. Yeah, I mean, I'd say by most, they kind of, I don't think you're crazy, but it's kind of like, you're focusing on something that, it's very hard to properly prove. I mean, by prove, I mean, go through the courts and that kind of mechanism. And yeah, I mean, for a long time, I'm looking at all this evidence, and my wife used to say to me, all this stuff, what are you going to do about it? And I think the only route I've got really available to me, for all its pros and cons, is the legal system. Yeah. And, I find myself in this bizarre situation where, because of this coroner's inquest that we have in the UK, if new evidence comes to light, or you think there hasn't been a sufficient inquiry into a person's death, you can use a mechanism to basically ask the Attorney General for England and Wales to reopen that inquest. And, you put forward an application full of new evidence, etc. So for me, yeah, it's like whatever the purgative labels that people use, I don't really care. It's, it's getting this stuff into court. And that's my goal, really, since my brother's, inquest in 2013.
Now, tell us about what was that? What was the inquest in 2013? Why was that 12 years later?
Well, it's a bit bizarre. It was actually opened in 2004. It involved 9 other British victims. There were 67 British victims in total, but I think 10 had their remains repatriated back to the UK. That automatically triggers an inquest. The official story is they were doing further investigation during the adjournment period. So, for 9 years, they were apparently investigating, the deaths of these 10 individuals. But it became very apparent when the actual inquest was held for 10 victims. It's the biggest, number of Brits killed abroad in a terrorist attack. It had no press coverage whatsoever. The whole inquest for all 10 victims was done in 1 hour and 40. Only 2 or 3 minutes was spent on my brother's life and death. It really was just a rubber stamp exercise. And we now since know, because we've got the court documents, they did 0 investigation into how my brother died. And they're supposed to do that by law. Even if they find it impossible, that there should be a proper trail of effort to try and find out how he died. And
in their mind, they think they know, right? I mean, they're like, well, he died in 9/11. Everybody knows how everybody died in 9/11.
Even if that is the case, they still have a duty to investigate. And I said, the fact that we put forward new evidence as part of our application, they're supposed to look at that, consider, whether that evidence could potentially change the verdict, if you like, and then in theory grant a new inquest to examine that evidence in court. And that's what I've been blocked with. The Attorney General won't allow that to happen.
Tell us about the new evidence.
So, I mean, the evidence is it's a mixture of eyewitness testimony. That's from first responders, including police officers on the day who were witness to explosive or explosions going off. You've got expert testimony from physicists, from chemists, etc., who have put forward their own analysis of how the towers came down. The analysis of the dust, which contains signatures of explosives. You've got just purely the physics of the way that the towers came down is fairly strong in its own way, in my opinion. And we could easily demonstrate that there wasn't a sufficient inquiry done either by NIST, because they didn't look for explosives. There are telltale signs. And we also introduced evidence of Building 7, which to me is just, very, very hard for anyone. Should that ever actually go into court for someone to actually argue that? I mean, I'd love to see a physicist argue against the free fall acceleration of a building. and argue that it's a natural progressive collapse is ridiculous to me.
Right. Now, your brother, did you ever get his remains back? You said
Yeah,
you
so
said you
that
got
was
some remains back because of this inquiry, that was triggered, right? This supposed investigation that there wasn't really. But tell us about his remains.
yeah. I mean, it's tiny fragments. We've had tranches of his remains in 2002, 2004, 2008, and actually after his inquest in 2013, we had some more remains found. But we're talking like sort of less than 5% of his body. And that's very common to have that kind of degree of fragmentation for people who have been identified. That said, one individual who was on the same floor was 86% whole. And, there is a degree of fragmentation. Not everyone is pulverized to small pieces, but that's very hard, to deal with. I mean, I don't know how my mum, really copes with that, because we both looked at his remains, and it's hard.
So you received 5%, and it was just fragments. And um, what does the coroner say about what? I mean, what do experts say about that? Is that so? He was on the floor. The plane hit. Where did the plane hit in relation to where he was? Was it right on the floor he was standing on that the plane hit? I mean, what would cause his body to be fragmented
I
like
mean,
that?
he was some 8 floors above the impact zone in the North Tower. For me, we try to reach out to forensic pathologists, because there are experts out there who deal with people who have died from the use of explosives, etc. And one chap had written extensively on it's almost like the proximity to explosives. If you're very close, it can lead to the complete disintegration of a body, whereas the further away you are, the more intact you remain. I've seen, which I shouldn't really be looking at, but a lot of aftermaths of earthquakes. So normal collapses due to earthquakes.
Right.
Large 30-story buildings, and people are obviously in a terrible state, but they are essentially whole. I mean, they are just they're not fragmented, and so the degree of fragmentation is crazy. You've got 5,000 body parts less than an inch in size. You've got about 22,000 body parts in total for the victims at World Trade Center. It's an average of sort of 7 to 8 parts per person, and obviously the average size is quite small.
Of all the
That's
victims, how many was everybody like that?
From the stats that there's been some papers published by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, and my understanding is about 25% of all the victims from the North and South Tower are less than 5% in total. That's obviously the people they've identified. If you take into account the 40% where there's nothing been identified, you're probably looking towards 50% of all the victims are less than 5%. And that just doesn't square with other natural building collapses at all.
Right. I mean, we've had plenty of other building collapses, I would imagine, around the world.
Yeah.
Like you said, earthquakes.
I was citing earthquakes in Turkey, for example. I mean, I've seen a lot of photographs, and people are essentially whole. It's horrific, but they aren't fragmented.
Right, of course. I mean, obviously they wouldn't be but not shred into a bunch of little tiny 1-inch pieces. I mean, that right there is super suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And what do they say to you about that? When you say, well, why is my brother in 1-inch pieces? Why did we only get 5% of him back? Why are there other victims? Same with a bunch of other people. And then, why is that? What do they say?
I mean, this is it. They didn't say anything. All they took was the death certificate from America, which basically said blunt trauma. That got translated into the UK, because we don't have blunt trauma. We have multiple injuries. So his cause of death is multiple injuries. That's it. I mean, but we know they did no investigation at all. I mean, apart from a brief statement my mum gave, which they read out, they just included the remains from 2002, 2004. Remember, it was adjourned in 2004 and opened in 2013. They couldn't even be bothered to include his remains that had been repatriated in 2008. So I do question, what were they doing for 9 years? there clearly wasn't an investigation going on at all.
And I don't think I've ever heard this aspect of it. I mean, I did not know that the people who died in 9/11, I didn't know that they were fragmented into a bunch of 1-inch pieces.
That came from. Sorry, yeah, Kim, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I really just didn't know this.
That came from a paper that Amy Mundorf wrote, who was one of the lead pathologists at the OCME. And, she basically says out of the 22,000 body parts, 5,000 are smaller than an inch, which is, crazy.
I mean, that leads to explosives. I mean, I don't, unless, and this is why I asked, was he on the floor where the plane came in? Because maybe a plane coming into a building acts similarly to an explosive. I don't know. But I would think, a giant plane coming into a building that may be. But I think we've had, there have been people who've died from planes slamming into their houses, or from, planes have flown into buildings, not in the same way as 9/11. But I mean, even people who are what about people that are in planes? Do we know what these are the gory details that nobody ever looks up, but I guess they're important details to find out.
I mean, they found 50% of AA-11's passengers on the roof of the Deutsche Bank building several years afterwards, because there were a lot of small fragments deposited along with, I think, some like life jackets, just bits and pieces from, I guess, the plane. So there was a tremendous fragmentation there. I mean, I think they found something like 800 body parts, and they all fitted pretty much into a couple of shoe boxes. I mean, it was that tiny, the fragments of people. So, I mean, yeah, I would expect a plane's impact, whether you're being hit or obviously people in the plane, to have a massive degree of fragmentation. But it's more the fact that, you can't have 50% of everyone, because there's an awful lot of floors, particularly in the North Tower, above the impact zone, and similarly for the South Tower.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense if it was like, well, the victims who were on the planes or who were standing on the floors where the planes directly had impact, then maybe that acted like an explosive, and I could understand then their bodies being fragmented, but not, like you said, 50% of all the people that were in the towers.
And I say, go back to that degree of fragmentation, the range. You've got someone on the same floor, 86%. Three people, including my brother, were less than 5% on the same floor, all at the same conference. To have that range is peculiar. My brother's remains, they weren't, majority of them weren't tagged as in where they found them location-wise, but his last remains, which were identified in 2013, were some 40 meters outside the south side of the North Tower, so outside the footprint. Again, if it was a normal pancake collapse, you'd expect them to be within the footprint. But, that wasn't how the towers came down.
Huh. Okay. So, I mean, that stuff is all pretty suspicious. So then it sounds almost like he was standing near where, if there were explosives that took the towers down, that he was standing closer to one of the explosives than somebody else on the same floor.
Yeah, I mean, that's what my research has led me to believe, yeah. And, I'm not an expert in that field, but that's what some forensic pathologists have said.
Well, you've been researching this for a really long time. You're certainly much more of an expert than I would say the vast majority of people. I mean, at this point, you probably could call yourself an expert if you've been researching it for as long as you have been. Okay, so what is your theory then? What do you think actually happened, based on everything that you've looked into?
That's complicated. I mean, what I always say to people, because you can almost show that there's an existing cover-up going on, is, first of all, look at the material support that Saudi Arabia gave. That was covered up with the infamous 28 pages, and still being covered up. You've got the 5 large lawsuits for Saudi Arabia lawsuits that are going on. Some, I think, 6,000 victim family members and survivors are part of that lawsuit. And, it's slow, but stuff is getting uncovered. You've got the CIA actively protecting 2 of the hijackers, Al Hazmi and Al Mindar, in Malaysia. in that summit in January 2000. And, the CIA, they knew that they had the multiple entry US visas. They blocked that from giving it to the FBI and, wherever that would have gone in theory, stopping those attacks. And then you've got what I call the foreknowledge, which I think Israel had, and whether that be the dancing Israelis, whether that be the stuff we found out through the Shia memorandum, which is the Israeli intelligence basically spying on both DEA officers in the US and literally living amongst 200 meters away, a lot of the future hijackers. That stuff is going through the courts. So you've got the Dan Canestraro declaration that's gone through Guantanamo Bay. I actually attended one of the pre-trials there back in 2017, I think, but which corroborates a lot of this CIA protection of two of the hijackers. So for me, it's I think a lot of people knew the attacks were coming. I think they were definitely facilitated. It wasn't just a case of letting it happen. Who's behind all this? I don't know. But I think you sort of look at how many countries are involved. You look at how families of the victims, myself included, are still asking for all the documents to get stuff unredacted, etc. Why is their cover-up still going on? That's been the biggest bugbear for me. So I've done so many freedom of information requests. That's to NIST, the National Institute of Standard Technologies, to the FBI. And, it's so infuriating for them to come back with some of their stock answers. We can either confirm or deny that such and such exists, or this is part of an ongoing investigation, which was always the excuse they gave. I presume that's because of the ongoing pre-trials at Guantanamo. But it just seems, we're coming into the 25th anniversary, for anyone, any American, any victim family member to still not have documents from those days. I just can't get my head around. You start to get very suspicious. It invites you to think there is a huge cover-up, and why are they covering up, and who are they covering up for? So what I'm trying to do is, this is inquests are quite narrow in scope. It's basically how someone died. But my questions go way further than just how my brother came about his death. I don't believe the official narrative on that. And I think all the evidence does point towards the use of explosives, incendiaries, something other than a natural collapse, caused by fire.
So you've been blocked by the courts and just getting stonewalled this entire time. But now you've had a bit of a breakthrough, and you are going to be able to go and present this case to the High Court. Is that right?
Well, so first of all, the Attorney General basically refused our application. It took nearly 2 years, but they refused it. They did actually refuse it again when we threatened litigation. But we're in a situation right now where the only process we have when an authority has made a decision is a process called judicial review. And so you basically get the judiciary, the courts, to look at, was that a rational legal decision that an authority made, in this case, the Attorney General. We went to the High Court, we threatened litigation, and they decided, rather than actually having a judicial review to look at our case, at the permission stage, they said, look, we need to go and sort out this issue of whether the Attorney General can actually even be reviewed in a court. They have this kind of anomalous superpower, which means they're above the law for certain gatekeeping functions, which is ludicrous, because in other aspects, they are amenable to the courts actually looking at their decision. So anyway, we went to the High Court in June this year. They sided with the Attorney General, basically saying, yeah, as it stands, because of the way a case was interpreted from the 1970s, the Attorney General is above the law. But they did say it's anomalous, and actually this issue needs to get sorted, and the only place that it can get sorted in is the Supreme Court. And so this summer we applied to the Supreme Court to appeal the decision, which is basically they're above the law. And, rather, not amazingly, because I was confident we would get it, but the fight still goes on, they granted that end of November. And so we've actually got a chance now to go to the Supreme Court, get rid of this ridiculous, almost regal power that the Attorney General has, which is they're above the law. for this particular gatekeeping function of public interest. And if we win at the Supreme Court, and I say if, there's a lot of hurdles still. That's raising money. That's obviously putting our case together and winning that case. We would then go back to the High Court and then, in theory, have the judicial review, have the courts look at the irrational and unlawful decision they made to deny my brother a new inquest.
And then you would maybe get a new inquest.
Yeah. I mean, the goal ultimately is to get a new inquest, ultimately to get evidence that, it's been amassed over the years, decades now, of, controlled demolition, to get that in a court of law and, to actually expose it. And this is the key thing. It's I know the court system in America, it frightens me, the amount of battles you have. But the coroner's court, it is a court of law, but it's not adversarial. It really is a fact-finding mission. And so you can present your evidence and it has to be, looked at and sifted and analysed by the coroner and, the various experts they'll bring in. And like I said, I'm interested to see a physicist defend the collapse of Building 7 and say it's natural. Yeah.
Right. So,
for instance.
9/11 was a long time ago, and definitely there were different people who were involved. A lot of these people that are now in the courts, that are judges, that are people in positions of power, they were just kids. They were young when 9/11 happened. So it's not the same group of people running the cover-up, I guess is what I'm trying to get at here. What do you think it is that is causing this new generation of people to continue to block this and cover this up? Because it's not the same people. You know what I'm saying? Like 24 years ago, it was a whole different group of people than it is today. And that group of people, maybe there was influence in some way, or they were shunned or shamed into the cover up. But what about today? Like, why would people today that are in their 50s say, yeah, we got to also go along with this cover up?
I mean, I think it is the case that they continue to cover up. But, and I talked about it when I did the talk in Washington in September on the 24th anniversary. I think there's a kind of sweet spot of between kind of 25 and 30 years where, for reasons, perhaps it is a lot of people who are either passed on or no longer in positions that need to maintain that cover up. Some truth starts to come through. And I always cite, Bloody Sunday from 1972. It took a long time, but the families, did get some semblance of justice. But more recently, the Hillsborough football disaster, where, nearly 100 fans died. Their initial inquest was returned accidental death. Those families fought and they started to get traction around 25 years later. So much so that they got new inquests and it's now down as unlawful killing because the police basically were involved, caused the deaths and covered it up along with some help with the government. And so, yeah, I mean, to your point, I think they kind of let go, that those that were in power and it mattered at the time when an event happened. I think enough time passes. I don't know whether we're going to get the full truth, but you do get those, opportunities to shed some light and, more importantly, go through, the courts where ultimately it's not the be all and end all, but at least it's something that's way more official than, any other way of examining an event. And, potentially actually getting people to be accountable for this. That's the thing that's driven me mad is the fact, going back to earlier on, we talked about intelligence failures, almost everyone got promoted. I mean, that to me is insane. They so failed that day. And yet almost everyone within all the agencies and the military got promoted in the US.
Yeah.
That's not right.
No, but unfortunately, it's kind of like a bad joke, when it's, or like a joke that's too soon, right? It's like, oh, you're not allowed to tell a joke too soon. And it's like with these investigations, oh, you're not allowed to know the truth too soon. Like, we just have to go with the narrative for a while. And then finally, when everybody calms down and enough time has passed and people don't feel so raw with the whole thing, or the emotions have toned down a bit, then now we can maybe start looking at the truth. I mean, it's just ridiculous, though. It shouldn't take 25, 30 years to get to the truth of an event like this and make families suffer with these, bizarre, ridiculous claims of how their loved ones died. When the family's sitting there saying, "Now I know that doesn't even make sense. Make that make sense," and they can't. They just say, "Oh, well, you just have to accept it. That's just what it is."
I mean, I'll tell you what was very telling was when we had the High Court hearing on this preliminary issue of justiciability. Is the Attorney General above the law? My KC, which is like a very senior barrister, senior lawyer in the UK, I mean, he just mused out loud in court saying he just couldn't get his head around why is the Attorney General so insistent on blocking this family's right to have a new inquest? Because when he first looked at our case, he went like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing High Court stuff? Why are we doing Supreme Court stuff? Because it really, for him, it was just an inquest should have been granted straight away. But he actually mused out loud saying, to the opposition's legal counsel, saying, has some sort of a deal been struck with President Trump, with a trade deal? Because it made no sense to him as to why they continue to block this. And more, I didn't say it earlier, but when we threatened litigation, it was the first time they basically used this get out of jail free card, which is, oh, we're above the law. It is, they don't play it all the time. They play it when they want to block and engage in lawfare, which is what is absolutely going on right now. I mean, they're trying to exhaust me emotionally, certainly, time-wise. Luckily I've got relative youth on my side, and also just financially. It's so hard to do this. Justice has a price, and to access that in this country is crazy. I'm guessing it's the same in the States.
Yeah, probably worse, actually. Or the legal system is extremely expensive. And it's really terrible, when people are wrongfully accused, or when, they want to get truth and justice. It's too costly, and they keep it that way to keep people from accessing it, which is terrible. Okay, so when is this hearing when is your next step?
So we think a hearing is going to be set. They'll put out some proposed dates for all parties involved, probably early in the new year. We don't anticipate it being any earlier than probably July. If it's not before July, we have the summer recess. I mean, it'll be kind of crazy. I have a horrible feeling that it might actually be in September, which is obviously around the 25th anniversary, which would be just, some irony there. But, our next steps are, first of all, it's just fundraising. I mean, I can't believe I'm at where I'm at right now, because I wouldn't have been able to do this without tremendous public support. But the situation right now is the Supreme Court is so expensive. Just to give you an idea, my the court fees to actually just be able to have the hearing are over $10,000. Which that's already the price to access justice, I guess. But I've got to raise over six figures to cover liabilities, because if I lose, I have to pay the Attorney General's fees. We already had to pay back in summer, losing in the High Court, $25,000 plus, and then obviously on top of that, I've got my own barristers fees to pay. So the next steps are probably early January. We're going to try and start doing some fundraising. You've interviewed, I think, Ted Walter before from the International Centre for 9/11 Justice. Yeah, we'll be working with him, and just basically trying to first of all, somehow in escrow cover my liability should we lose. But obviously, more importantly, is actually raising the legal fees so I can engage the two legal counsel that I need in order to fight this. I'm very confident. For all its faults, the legal system on paper we win all the way. I mean, it's so frustrating. And I've heard from other people who have had similar fights, and it's like who won, but it's almost like it's just that lawfare. Every single stage they're trying to block you because they're hoping you give up. And one other point I'd say, Kim, about I guess why am I so positive about this is the Supreme Court does often rule against the government. It really isn't a bought and paid for Supreme Court. You've got, I think, 12 judges there. We're probably going to have between either five or seven judges. And to give you an idea, the guy who actually, one of the three panel of judges who gave permission for our appeal to go ahead, actually wrote a scathing article in 2018 about this idea of immunity from anyone in government or indeed an actual state having immunity. It's just wrong in this modern day and age to give anyone that kind of protection. So I'm quietly confident, but the biggest hurdle right now is actually raising the money to be able to continue the fight.
Have you started the fundraising? Can we help in any way?
We haven't got anything live right now. I said
Okay.
I'm going to work along TED with ic911.org in January. But right now the key thing would be to make sure the liabilities are covered, because I'm not wealthy at all, and to lose would be catastrophic. I'd go bankrupt.
Right. Okay.
That,
Well, definitely when that's live, then we'll either have you back on or maybe Ted back on and talk more about it so that we can help you guys fundraise a little bit for this, because it is a very, we deserve the truth, and they've just lied to us for so long, and they get away with it. They know they can just feed us little bits of information, and a lot of stuff doesn't add up, and they say, well, then you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, that's just kind of their rebuttal, and they've done that to us for years and years. But I think people are waking up. People aren't accepting the narratives, the official narratives from the government on a lot of things, not just on 9/11, but on a lot of things. But the fact that they're not believing them on other things leads people then back to say, well, what else have I not questioned that I should maybe question? And then they start questioning things like 9/11. And then they start looking into it and saying, yeah, you know what, actually, this doesn't make sense. Why was it a bunch of Saudis, but we went and invaded Iraq, and then we went into Afghanistan? Like, somebody explained that to us. And what about the Israelis? And now we know that they knew in advance. Whether or not they were involved in it, that's still yet to be determined, but we know they knew. And what good did that do us? Some allies helping us out there. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I'd never heard that the bodies were fragmented to the level that you're talking about. And that definitely supports the theories that many people have had for a while, which is that there were explosives in those buildings, particularly Building 7. Building 7 is a very bizarre. We see buildings collapsing all the time, and we don't see surrounding buildings coming down. It just doesn't. It doesn't even make sense.
No,
a lot of it's not making sense.
It's like you say, it's not just 9/11. You just start looking into almost anything with an analytical eye, and it's not necessarily rabbit holes, because you can get lost down some of them. But for me, 9/11, because of everything it led to, is still important. To get to the truth of it.
Yeah. So where can people go now to learn more? Especially about the evidence that you've had, and to follow your case, and should they follow you on X or somewhere? Like, where can people get more information?
I think the best place is probably ic911.org.
Okay.
That just, it's a website, lots of articles there, and updates about my case. On X, my handle's Matt Campbell 911. If people want to follow what's going on in my case. It's going to be, a big year next year, not least 25th anniversary. I am hoping my family go out to New York in September. Most haven't been back or even been there at all since the attacks. And in a year where hopefully we're going to make some progress towards a new inquest as well.
Well, Matt, I wish you the best of luck. I know a lot of people watching right now are wishing you the absolute best of luck, and thank you for doing the fight. A lot of us we have a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions, but it's I know for you it's personal because you lost a family member, and but I know that many of us appreciate the work that you're doing toward this to get us all the answers, not just for you and your family, but for, I think all of us were victimized in a variety of different ways because of that event. It's been used against us, weaponized for war. Many people have died subsequently through war. And so it's important we get to the truth, and we're glad that we have people like you actually doing it. So thank you. And thank you for being here, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can watch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific at KimIversonShow.com. See you there.